this is Mrs. Suter, and I'm going to read The Lincoln's Way by Patricia Polacco. Mr. Lincoln's Way. Mr. Lincoln was the coolest principal in the whole world, or so his students thought. He had the coolest clothes, he had the coolest smile, and did the coolest things. Just like Mrs. Suter. He had tea parties with Mrs. West's kindergarten every spring. He took Mr. Bliss's sixth grades on nature walks in the fall. He set up his telescope next to the pond in back of school on special nights and invited kids and their families to come and look at the stars. And in the winter, he was Santa for the Christmas play. He lit the Marana for Hanukkah. He wore a dashiki for Kwanzaa and a bunos for Ramadan. Mr. Lincoln was just plain cool. Absolutely everybody thought so, except Eugene Esterhaus. This guy right there. Mean Gene is what everybody called him. Mean Gene sassed the teachers and beat up on most of the other kids on the playground. He was no student at all. He drove Mrs. Dunkel crazy in English. Mrs. Chu wanted to drop him out of art. And he was a bully. He always seemed to be angry, picking on kids and calling them names. He's not a bad boy, really, Mr. Lincoln said, only troubled. To just about everybody in school, though, Eugene was trouble, with a capital T. Then one day he leered at a first grader. "What are you looking at, scumball?" he said, and he pushed her down and took her backpack away. "I'm going to tell Mr. Lincoln," she said. "Go ahead, you little brat. I ain't afraid of that man." Then he stopped. Mr. Lincoln was standing right there. The bell rang, and Eugene ran away. Now, Eugene was in Mr. Lincoln's thoughts more than ever. He knew he had to find a way to reach that young man. Then one day, as Mr. Lincoln was helping the fifth grade plant a tree in the beautiful new atrium, he noticed that Eugene was looking up into the branches of one of the trees. There sat a bright red cardinal. 2 other days, Mr. Lincoln had seen Eugene standing at the atrium window, watching birds on the tree. Mr. Lincoln wondered, was it possible that... Look at there, Eugene is looking at the outside at the birds. It wasn't a day later when Mr. Lincoln called Eugene into his office. Eugene slumped in the chair. Mr. Lincoln took a beautiful book out of his desk drawer, a book in blazing color, all about birds. He turned to one page and studied the illustration. "I've got these little birds all over my tree, and I don't know what they are." Eugene got out of his chair and walked closer. "Those are red-capped nuthatches. Weird to see them this time of year." "You seem to know about your birds," Principal Lincoln said with a warm smile. "I do. When I lived on my grandpa's farm, he had tons of birds around. Chickens, thrashers, meadowlarks. We raised carrier pigeons together." "You've got quite a grandpa," Mr. Lincoln said. But Eugene just turned his back on Mr. Lincoln and left the room. A week had gone by when Eugene ran into Mr. Lincoln by the atrium looking sad. "I have a problem," Mr. Lincoln said. "So," Eugene said, "that atrium was supposed to be full of birds, but they're just not coming." The principal looked into the empty atrium. "Wrong plants in there to make them want to stay. Not the right food either," Eugene said as he walked away. "Your grandpa teach you that?" the principal said. Eugene turned and looked at Mr. Lincoln for the first time. "Maybe." "Do you suppose you could help us attract birds here to our atrium, Eugene?" Mr. Lincoln handed him a book, and perhaps this would help. Eugene seemed stunned at first. Then he took the beautiful book on birds in his hands, wrapped it in his arms, and ran down the hallway. As the day passed, Eugene never seemed to be without that book. His English teacher let Eugene read passages from the book in class. "I'm so pleased to see him reading," Mr. Dunkel exclaimed. And when he didn't have his nose in that book, he was almost constantly out in the atrium. He and Mr. Lincoln made a list of plants and shrubs to buy and types of grain and seeds to feed the birds. They even built 3 bird feeders together, the principal and Eugene. Then, when it started to happen, the birds began to come. Nuthatchers, bluebirds, and many colorful finches. So many different kinds that the whole school stood from time to time just to watch the wonder of them in the atrium. Eugene seemed generally happy. He didn't even tease the other kids anymore. Do you know what an atrium is? An atrium is like what we have in the back, in between, when you come out of gym, you can see the atrium. Then one day, Mrs. Chew burst into Mr. Lincoln's office. There are 2 mallard ducks nesting in the atrium. Mr. Lincoln rushed to the hall, and sure enough, there in the atrium were a male and a female mallard. And there was their nest near the corner of the atrium. Mr. Lincoln saw Eugene on the other side of the atrium, giving him a thumbs up. I was hoping that they might be a mating pair, Eugene said one day, as he and Mr. Lincoln looked back at 5 perfect eggs in the nest. Just one problem. The ducklings will need to be near water. They'll need to get to the pond outside. They can't fly out of the top like their parents. You'll think of something, Eugene. I know you will, Mr. Lincoln said, and he put his hand on Eugene's shoulder. It was nice that Mean Gene wasn't mean anymore. Do you remember that we had those ducks in our atrium too? And do you remember we filled that up with water and the ducks would swim in there? Hey, this story is just like Joy School. It was only 3 days later there was a commotion in the hall. Mrs. Belding rushed into Mr. Lincoln's office with Eugene in tow. Mr. Lincoln looked at Eugene in disbelief. What happened? I'll let Eugene tell you, the teacher said. But Eugene said nothing. He just sat looking hateful and defiant. Trouble in the lunch line, she went on. He singled out 2 of our students from Mexico. He called them brown-skinned toads and other unacceptable names. I'll take care of this, said the principal. Mr. Lincoln sat down in front of the boy. Eugene, my skin is brown too. Eugene just looked at Mr. Lincoln. This I know, Eugene. Someone who loves birds the way you do couldn't possibly have that kind of hate in his heart. Then Eugene began to cry. My old man got really mad when I got home late from helping you, he said, and he cried. He said you're not our kind. Our kind, Mr. Lincoln murmured. He led Eugene to the window of the atrium. It was alive with the song of birds. I see sparrows, jays, cardinals, nuthatches, and the mallards. Don't all of those beautiful types and colors make this a beautiful place to be in for all of them? Eugene nodded, yes. Well, God made all of them, all kinds, just like he made all of us, Eugene. Fact is, all of you children here with all your cool differences are my little birds. Yes, my little birds. And that should be your answer as to what is right or wrong in what your father said. That principle is saying that there's many different kinds of people. My old man calls you real bad names, Mr. Lincoln. He's got an ugly name for just about everybody that's different for us. Mr. Lincoln didn't talk for the longest time. Eugene, sometimes people get trapped in their thinking almost as surely as those ducklings will be trapped in the atrium. Mr. Lincoln said thoughtfully, my grandpa just wasn't like that. Mr. Lincoln put his arm around the boy's shoulders. I'd like to meet that grandpa, but Eugene, you have to promise me, even when bad things happen at home, here at school you need to treat all of my little birds with kindness and respect. No more teasing and name-calling. Please promise me. Eugene promised he wouldn't say any more bad names. Eugene was good to his word. He became a model student. He tried with all his heart to keep his promise to the principal. Then one bright morning, Eugene stopped at the atrium window. The eggs were starting to hatch. He ran from room to room and brought the whole school to watch. The ducks were hatching one by one. At first they were wet and unsteady, but in a short time they were fuzzy and running and racing about. That's just what happened in our little area. This even looks like Joy School's atrium. As the days passed, the ducks' parents flew out of the atrium, landing on the pond just behind school. They were leaving their babies for longer and longer periods of time. Eugene and Mr. Lincoln knew that the time was approaching when they would need to get the ducklings out of the atrium and into the pond. They had a plan. When the big day arrived, classes were asked to stay in their rooms. Then Eugene and Mr. Lincoln opened the door to the atrium and stepped in. They had both practiced saying ging, ging, like the Mallard parents. Now they talked to the ducklings, coaxing them to follow. The father duck waddled up to the doorway of the atrium and peered down the hall. At the end of a hall, the father duck could see the lawn and the pond. Ging, ging, Eugene called. The mother duck came out first, then one by one her babies followed. Eugene walked down the hall, calling to them and over as the family waddled behind them. Then all at once the mother and the father took the lead and the ducklings were scurried after them. At the outside doorway, they stopped for a moment. Then the mother and father duck jumped out of the doorway and coaxed each of their ducklings to follow. Now, we didn't do that. We let the ducks just fly away on their own. The mom left, the dad left, and then once the ducks were old enough to fly, we let them out and they went. We didn't go through the school. Mr. Lincoln and Eugene both stood and watched as the ducklings raced down the hillside and plopped into the pond with their parents. Now I know where the expression, like a duck takes to water, comes from, the principal laughed. He couldn't believe how well the babies swam. Parents had gathered at the top of the hill. They had been invited to watch from afar. Then Eugene heard a voice from behind him that called out his name. Eugene, boy, over here. It was grandfather. The boys raced up the hill. Mr. Lincoln joined them both. This is my grandpa, Eugene sang out. I know, Mr. Lincoln said. Eugene turned toward him. Had Mr. Lincoln something to do with this miracle, with his grandpa being here? Now the old man shook Mr. Lincoln's hand. I sure would like to stay with you again, Grandpa, Eugene said as he and his grandfather walked up the hill together. The old man put his arm around the boy's shoulders. We'll see, son. We'll sure see. Later, Eugene and Mr. Lincoln walked down by the pond together. Eugene needed to say something to Mr. Lincoln. You showed those ducklings the way out, Eugene, Mr. Lincoln said. Hey, you showed me the way out, Principal Lincoln, Eugene smiled. Then he stopped and looked into his principal's eyes. I'll make you proud of me someday, Mr. Lincoln, I promise. And do you know that's the end of the book, but at the end, Mean Gene, the bad kid, it says here, he became a fourth grade teacher. After all that, he grew up, he became a fourth grade teacher, and he called his students my little birds. Well, Joy students, you're all my little birds too. I hope you like this book, Mr. Lincoln's Way, because it's sort of like Mrs. Suter's Way. Thank you.